The judge looked at my daughter across the courtroom and asked her a question I'd been waiting 3 years to hear someone else ask. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're telling this court your father is mentally incompetent to manage his own finances. Is that your position?" My daughter's lawyer started to rise, but the judge held up one hand without even looking at him. "I'm asking her directly, counselor." My daughter stood. She was wearing the gray blazer I'd bought her 2 Christmases ago. I noticed that. I noticed everything about her that afternoon. The way she smoothed the front of her jacket, the way her husband sat just slightly too far back in his chair, like he was already preparing to distance himself from what was about to happen. "Your Honor," she said, "my father has been making a series of financial decisions that my husband and I believe are not in his best interest. We're concerned about his judgment." The judge looked at her for a long moment. "Not in his best interest," she repeated. "And these concerns, did they arise before or after he stopped transferring money into your account?" The courtroom was very quiet after that. I should back up. My name is Gordon. Wait, no. I need to start where this actually started. Not in a courtroom in Hamilton, Ontario, but in a hospital room in the same city. 14 months earlier, the night my hip gave out on me while I was coming down the back stairs of my own house. I was 63 years old. I'd spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the city, retired with a decent pension, and I'd been careful with money my whole life the way my parents taught me to be careful. We grew up in Sudbury. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. You learned early that things didn't come to you. You went to them. My late wife Carol understood that. We understood each other completely. Carol died 6 years before any of this happened. Breast cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I sold the house we'd raised our daughter in and moved into a smaller place in Hamilton, closer to downtown, easier to manage on my own. I didn't need much. I had my pension, my RRSP, the proceeds from the sale of the family home. I was comfortable. More than comfortable, honestly. That was the problem. In retrospect, that was always the problem. My daughter Melissa had married a man named Troy when she was 26. Troy sold commercial insurance and had an easy way about him that I'd initially liked. He was funny at dinner. He remembered the names of people you mentioned in passing. He drove a nice car, always a slightly newer one that made sense given what I knew of their finances, but I told myself that wasn't my business. They had a son, my grandson Callum. He was 8 years old when all of this started. And he is the reason I sat through everything I sat through without losing my mind entirely. The first time Melissa asked me for money was 3 months after Carol died. I understood it as grief. She'd lost her mother. She was emotional. She and Troy had been stretched thin for a while. She needed $4,200 to cover some bills they'd fallen behind on. I wrote the check without hesitating. Of course I did. She was my daughter. The second time was 5 months after that. Troy's car needed work, something expensive, and the repair cost more than they'd expected. Could I help with $2,800? I helped. Then it became regular. Not always the same amount, not always with a specific reason. Sometimes it was framed as a loan. Sometimes it wasn't framed as anything, just a mention that they were tight this month. A pause, my response filling in the space. I don't know exactly when the habit formed or whose habit it really was, but by the time 3 years had passed, I had given them just under $190,000. That number sounds impossible to me even now. It wasn't given all at once. It was $3,000 here, $6,500 there, a mortgage payment 1 month, property tax assistance another, a trip they wanted to take to Portugal. I paid for the flights and the hotel because it was Callum's first time overseas and I wanted him to have that. I also bought them a car, a 2021 Subaru Outback, paid outright, $38,000. Because Troy's car was unreliable and Melissa drove Callum to school and to his hockey practices 3 times a week and I didn't like them in an unreliable vehicle. I want to be honest about something because I've thought about it a great deal since. I wasn't blind. I knew Troy spent money carelessly. I knew Melissa had never really lived within a budget because I'd never made her. My wife and I had given her everything she needed and she had grown up with a soft floor under her, And when Carol died, that floor somehow became me specifically. I knew these things and I kept writing checks anyway, partly because I missed Carol and helping felt like something, partly because Callum's face when I showed up was worth everything, partly because I had convinced myself that saying no would damage something that I couldn't repair. I was wrong about all of it. I understand that now. The fall happened on a Thursday evening in November. I was carrying a bag of recycling down the back stairs and my hip, the right one I'd had some arthritis building for years, went completely. I hit the last 3 steps and the concrete landing, and I lay there for what felt like a long time before I managed to get my phone out of my pocket. The paramedics said I'd fractured the hip, bruised 3 ribs, and had a mild concussion from where my head had clipped the metal railing on the way down. I called Melissa from the hospital. It was around 9 at night. She answered on the 4th ring. I told her what happened. I told her I was going to need surgery the next morning and that I would need some help when I got home, at least for the first few weeks, because getting up and down the stairs was going to be difficult and I wasn't supposed to be alone. There was a pause. "Dad," she said, "this is really bad timing. We're supposed to leave for Costa Rica on Sunday." I thought I hadn't heard her correctly. "I'm sorry." "We've been planning this trip for 8 months. Troy already got the time off work. Callum's been so excited about it." I lay there in that hospital bed with my hip in pieces and I said, "Melissa, I'm going to have surgery tomorrow morning." "I know, Dad, I feel terrible, but the flights are non-refundable, and honestly, the resort has a really strict cancellation policy. We'd lose the deposit, and that's a lot of money." Money that I'd given her. I didn't say that. I lay there, and I didn't say it. "You could hire someone," she said, "like a home care worker. The VON does that, right? You could call them. They probably come pretty quickly." I told her I'd figure it out. "Call me after surgery," she said. "I love you." They went to Costa Rica. My neighbor Bev, who I'd barely spoken to in 2 years beyond waving from the driveway, brought me home from the hospital and stocked my fridge and sat with me on the first night because she'd noticed the ambulance and put 2 and 2 together. She was 71, recently retired from nursing, and she was matter-of-fact about the whole thing in a way that I found deeply calming. She didn't say anything about Melissa. I hadn't told her exactly, but she was a retired nurse. I think she understood from the shape of things. I spent 11 days recovering alone, with Vaughan workers coming in the morning and evening before Melissa came by. She brought flowers and Troy brought a bottle of wine, and they stayed for an hour and a half. Troy asked about the hockey playoffs. Callum had drawn me a get well card at school, which Melissa had forgotten in the car, and she made a joke about it and promised to drop it off another time. The card arrived in the mail 3 weeks later. Callum had addressed the envelope himself. I put it on the fridge. That was the night something shifted in me. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was quieter than that, the way a decision you've already made slowly becomes visible to you, like something floating up from deep water. I called my financial advisor the following week. Then I called a lawyer, a woman named Whitfield, who specialized in estate planning and had been recommended by a colleague. Then I sat down with a notepad and did the arithmetic I'd been avoiding for 3 years. $184 given over approximately 36 months, plus the car, plus the Portugal trip, plus 4 or 5 other things I'd paid directly, insurance deductibles, a dental bill Troy had mentioned. Close to $245,000 in total. I transferred money into my own account, reviewed my will, and updated the beneficiary information on my RASP and TFSA. I did not tell Melissa I was doing any of this. Then I stopped the monthly transfers. I didn't call to explain it. I didn't send a letter. I simply stopped, the way a tap gets turned off. 2 days later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. "The transfer didn't come," Melissa said. "I know." "Is something wrong with your bank account?" "No." A long pause. "Dad, what's going on?" I told her I'd been thinking about things while I recovered. I told her I'd done the math. I told her I wasn't going to continue the transfers. The call lasted 40 minutes and was one of the more painful conversations of my life. She cycled through confusion, then hurt, then something that sounded like genuine fear, then anger, Then a kind of cold formality I'd never heard from her before. She said I didn't understand how hard things were for them. She said Carol would never have done this. She said I was being cruel. She said I'd obviously been influenced by someone. Had Bev said something to me, and that I wasn't thinking clearly. That last part stayed with me. The next 3 months were mostly silence. Callum's hockey season ended, and I wasn't invited to the playoff game, which I found out about afterward through a message he sent me from his mom's phone. "I'm sorry you couldn't come, Grandpa." That sentence sat in my chest for a long time. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late March, I received paperwork from a law firm in Mississauga. My daughter and her husband were applying to have me assessed for capacity under the Substitute Decisions Act. They were contesting my ability to manage my own finances. They had attached a letter from a doctor I had never met or heard of, a letter that described symptoms and behaviors I had never exhibited, and which concluded that I showed signs of diminished financial judgment consistent with early cognitive decline. I read it 3 times. Then I called my lawyer. "This happens more than people know," she told me calmly. "When someone with assets stops providing financial support and the recipients feel entitled to that support, they sometimes pursue capacity challenges as a legal mechanism. The medical document you're describing is almost certainly going to be the central issue. We'll need to have you assessed by an independent physician immediately." "Can they actually take over my finances?" "Not if we demonstrate you're competent, which should be straightforward, but the cost of defending it is real, and that's often the point. Pressure." I had a full cognitive assessment done at Hamilton Health Sciences. I scored in the 94th percentile for my age group. My doctor wrote a letter that was 11 paragraphs long and contained the phrase, "no evidence whatsoever of diminished capacity," 3 times in different forms. We were in court on a Wednesday in June. I sat on one side of the courtroom with my lawyer. Melissa and Troy sat on the other side with theirs, a sharp-faced man who kept touching his tie. Melissa did not look at me when she came in. Troy looked at the ceiling. The judge was a woman about my age, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and an expression of steady, contained patience that I suspected had been forged over many years of watching exactly this kind of thing. She reviewed the medical documents. She reviewed the independent assessment. She asked Melissa's lawyer a series of questions about the doctor who had written the original letter, questions the lawyer answered with increasing discomfort. She asked Troy directly whether he had initiated contact with that physician. Troy said he couldn't recall. The judge wrote something down. Then she looked at my daughter. "Mrs. Whitmore, at the time your father fractured his hip and underwent surgery, you went ahead with a previously scheduled vacation. Is that accurate?" Melissa's lawyer started to stand. The judge waved him back down with one finger. "I'm asking your client directly." Melissa's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. Your father had surgery the morning after he called you, and you left for Costa Rica 2 days later. The trip we'd already paid." "Paid with whose money, Mrs. Whitmore?" The courtroom was extremely quiet. The judge didn't wait for an answer. She looked down at her documents and then looked up again with an expression, "I will not forget." "This petition is dismissed. The applicants have failed to provide any credible evidence of cognitive impairment, and the independent assessment submitted by the respondent is thorough, recent, and unambiguous. Furthermore, I'm ordering costs against the applicants. Mr. Curtis, your client, is responsible for the respondent's legal fees." She looked at the number my lawyer had submitted. $22,400, payable within 90 days. Melissa made a sound I couldn't interpret. "Counselor," the judge added, looking at the other lawyer, "I'd like you to take a very careful look at the provenance of the medical document your client submitted before you file anything else in this jurisdiction. We're done." The gavel came down. My lawyer shook my hand. "Clean sweep," she said quietly. Across the room, Troy was on his feet, leaning toward their lawyer, talking fast and low. Melissa stood with her arms crossed, staring at the floor. She looked, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like she had absolutely no idea what to do next. In the parking lot, my lawyer walked me to Bev's car. Bev had driven me and was waiting with the engine running and the radio on. "They can't pay the $22,000, I said. "Almost certainly not," my lawyer agreed. "Which means we can pursue enforcement. Liens against assets, wage garnishment. It has a way of clarifying things. I got in the car. Beth pulled out of the parking lot without saying anything for about 2 minutes, and then she said, "How do you feel?" "Strange," I said. "Good and strange." My phone buzzed. "Melissa." I declined it. It buzzed again. Declined. By the time we got to my house, I had 39 missed calls, alternating between Melissa and Troy. I listened to the first few voicemails. Troy's were controlled and lawyerly, about wanting to discuss a resolution. Melissa's were not controlled at all. By the 7th message, her voice was at a pitch I'd never heard from her before. She called me vindictive. She said I was destroying my family. She said Carol would be ashamed of me. I saved all of them to a folder and sent the folder to my lawyer. Then I made tea and sat in my kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard where I'd built. Callum a raised garden bed the previous spring, the one he'd grown tomatoes in, the one he'd been so proud of. He'd taken a photograph and sent it to me with the caption, "Look, Grandpa, they're real tomatoes." The bed was still there. It needed to be turned over for winter. I'd meant to do it before the hip gave out. I thought about a lot of things sitting there. The weeks after the hearing were quieter than I'd expected. No more calls after the first couple of days. Beeve mentioned, carefully, that she'd seen a moving truck at Melissa's house. Not to alarm me, just, she'd noticed. I filed that away. Through my lawyer, I learned their financial situation had deteriorated significantly. They'd taken out a line of credit to fund the capacity challenge. Troy's income had taken a hit. He'd lost a major client. They were behind on the mortgage. The Subaru I'd bought them had been traded in for an older vehicle, something cheaper to run. Callum called me on a Saturday afternoon from his own phone. Melissa had apparently relented on that, or hadn't been paying attention. He said he was okay. He said school was good. He said things were a bit weird at home, and I told him that things would sort themselves out and that none of it was his business to worry about. I asked him how hockey was going, and he told me they'd lost their last 3 games, but he'd scored a goal in the second one and was still pretty pleased about it. I told him I was proud of him. "Can I come over sometime?" he said. "Whenever you want, bud. You know where I am." There was a long pause, and then he said, "Mom said you don't want to see us anymore." I took a breath. "Callum, I always want to see you. That has never changed for 1 single minute." He didn't say anything, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and I just waited. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, Grandpa." 2 months after the court hearing, on a gray October morning, Troy called me. Not Melissa. Troy. "I'd like to talk," he said. "Just the 2 of us, no lawyers." We met at a Tim Hortons near the escarpment, neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived. He looked like he'd aged 5 years. His jacket was a size too large, or he'd lost weight. I wasn't sure which. His coffee was almost empty, and he'd clearly been sitting there a while. I sat down across from him and didn't say anything. I let him start. He put both hands around his cup. "We're probably going to lose the house," he said. "The mortgage is 3 months behind. Melissa knows. She's known for a while." I waited. "I wanted to tell you something without Melissa here because she won't. She's not ready to say this yet, and maybe she never will be. But I think you deserve to hear it." He looked up. "What we did was wrong. Not just the petition. All of it. For years, we let you support us because it was easy, and we told ourselves it was family. It was what family did, and we never once asked whether it was fair to you." He paused. "When you fell down those stairs, and I found out you'd called Melissa, and we went to Costa Rica anyway, I didn't fight her on it. She said the trip was already paid for, and I said, yeah, okay, fine. And I've thought about that a lot since. I should have said no. I should have said we're not getting on that plane." His voice flattened. I didn't. I looked at him for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Callum asks about you every day. Because you're his grandfather, and he loves you, and we've been telling him things that aren't fair to you and aren't fair to him." He looked down at the table, and because I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I've been hoping that if I said it out loud to you, it might start to be real, that I might actually start to change. I sipped my coffee. Outside the window, a woman was walking a dog that was extremely interested in a discarded coffee cup on the sidewalk. Normal life, continuing normally, regardless of anything. I'm not going to restore the transfers, I said. I want to be clear about that immediately. I know. I'm not asking for that. And I haven't changed my will, but I'm not going to tell you anything about my will. I understand. What are you actually going to do if you lose the house? He exhaled. Rent somewhere. Something we can actually afford. Melissa has a job interview next week, marketing coordinator. Not what she's used to, but it's a real salary. I've picked up 2 new accounts this month. He almost smiled. A tired and unfamiliar version of it. Turns out when you can't call your father-in-law, if a number comes up short, you get creative. I looked at him for a while longer. I want to see Callum, I said, properly, not phone calls. I want him to be able to come here, spend time with me, and I don't want him to feel caught between anything when he does. If Melissa can't bring herself to agree to that, then we've got nothing to talk about. She'll agree to it. You're sure of that? He nodded once, and for the first time I believed he was telling me the truth about something. I drove myself home. My hip had healed well enough to drive, to walk without a cane, to work in the backyard. I turned over the raised garden bed that afternoon, the one Callum had grown his tomatoes in. The soil had gone hard over the winter, but it was workable. I broke it up, added some compost, turned it through. Standing there, I thought about Carol. She had been a direct woman who would have said something clearly uncomfortable to me before any of this got so far. She would have said, "You're not helping her, you're preventing her from helping herself." She had said things like that to me about other things over the years, and she had usually been right, and I had sometimes listened and sometimes not. I missed her in a way that hadn't really changed in 6 years, but I had stopped confusing missing her with standing in her place between Melissa and every hard thing. Callum came over for the first time on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after my conversation with Troy. He arrived with a backpack and an excited energy he had trouble containing, which was his normal state, which I loved. He wanted to see if the old road bike in my garage still worked. He wanted to know what was growing in the garden. He told about his hockey team and a friend named Jack, who was apparently, in Callum's considered opinion, both an excellent defenseman and a complete chaos agent. I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, which he'd liked since he was 4. At some point in the afternoon, while we were both leaning over the engine of a clock radio, I was trying to fix a project with no particular deadline and no particular stakes. The best kind. He said, without looking up, "Mom's been different lately." Different how? Less mad, I think. He turned a screw experimentally. She cried the other night. I heard her. I didn't go in because I thought she might want to be by herself. But then I went and knocked on the door, and she let me in, and we just sort of watched TV for a while. He handed me a small Phillips head. "I think she misses you." I didn't say anything. "Do you miss her?" I thought about it the way I try to think about things that matter. Honestly, without rushing to the comfortable answer. "Yes," I said. "I miss the version of her that used to exist before things went sideways. I'm not sure yet which version she's going to be going forward." He considered this with the seriousness that 9-year-olds sometimes bring to things that adults think are too complicated for them. "That's fair," he said. He sounded, for a moment, uncannily like Carol. Melissa called me the following Tuesday. She was quiet on the phone, a different kind of quiet than the silence of the last several months. It felt like effort, like she was choosing words carefully for the first time in a long time. "I owe you an apology," she said. "More than one. I don't think I'm ready to say everything I need to say yet, but I wanted to start somewhere." I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't fine, and we both knew it, and I think she needed to hear that I wasn't going to paper over it. "I appreciate you calling," I said. A pause. "Callum says you made grilled cheese." Old recipe. He's still partial to it. He talked about that afternoon for 3 days. Another pause, something shifting in her voice, something that might become grief before it became anything else. I didn't know how much I'd interrupted, did I? "Between you and him?" "No," I said, "I don't think you did. We talked for 20 minutes. We didn't resolve anything. We didn't pretend to. I told her I thought it would take time and that I was willing to give it time if she was. And she said she was. and I believed it maybe 70%, which was more than I believed anything she'd said in a long while. The house sold in January. They moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Stony Creek, 10 minutes from me, which I wasn't sure was deliberate or coincidental, and decided not to examine too closely. Troy was working long hours. Melissa had started the marketing job and sent me a message in late February that said only, "I like it. I'm actually good at it." I wrote back, "Of course you are." I arranged separately with my lawyer to set up an education trust for Callum, not through Melissa, not through Troy. In Callum's name, administered independently, accessible when he turned 18. It wasn't the same as everything I'd given before, and it wasn't meant to be. It was for him specifically, for something that was his. In March, on a clear Saturday that still had winter in it but was starting to consider giving way, I picked Callum up and we drove out to Christie Lake, just outside of town, where I'd gone fishing as a boy and hadn't been back to in probably 20 years. Callum had never fished. He was extremely impatient and extremely interested and talked almost continuously for the first hour, which didn't bother the fish because we weren't catching any anyway. We sat there in the cold quiet with our lines out. "Grandpa," he said. "Yeah. Are you okay? Like, are you actually okay?" I looked out at the water. A pair of geese were moving across the far end of the lake, unhurried, leaving 2 smooth lines behind them in the gray surface. "Yeah," I said, "I actually am." He nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and went back to watching his line with the intensity of someone who had decided that fish were simply going to have to respect his commitment. We didn't catch anything that day. We went back the following Saturday and caught 2 small bass that Callum photographed from every possible angle before releasing. The look on his face when the second one slipped back into the water was one of those moments you store somewhere specific, somewhere you can find it again when you need it. I'd spent years confusing generosity with love, and love with the inability to say no. I'd spent years believing that the softness I offered was protecting the people I cared about, when mostly what it was doing was protecting me from the discomfort of watching them face the things they needed to face. I'd learned my lesson. The question was whether the people around me had learned theirs. Standing at the edge of Christie Lake with my grandson, watching the water settle back into itself, I found that I was genuinely unsure and genuinely at peace with being unsure. Some things take time. Some things you don't get to know the ending of on any particular day. The afternoon light came down flat and cold through the bare trees. Callum was already rebating his hook, talking to himself under his breath about technique, certain that this next cast was going to be the one. I put my line back in the water and waited. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom, not the voicemails, not even the night I lay at the bottom of those stairs waiting for someone to answer. It's the afternoon I turned over Callum's garden bed. Just me, a spade, cold soil, nobody watching, nothing to prove to anyone. I spent a long time believing that generosity was the same thing as love, that if I kept the floor soft enough under Melissa, she'd never have to learn how hard the ground actually was. I told myself it was protection. It wasn't. It was avoidance, mine as much as hers. Every check I wrote without a conversation attached to it was me choosing my own comfort over her growth. That's a difficult thing to admit, but it's true, and I think the truth of it is part of why things went as far as they did. What I've come to understand is that real care for someone means being honest about what you're doing and why. It means having the harder conversation early, not letting a pattern calcify over years until the only way to change it is to blow the whole thing up. I wasn't a dishonest man, but I was an avoidant one in this particular corner of my life, and avoidance has a way of collecting interest. When Melissa filed that capacity challenge, when I sat in a courtroom and watched my own daughter claim I wasn't fit to manage my affairs, I had 2 choices. I could collapse under the weight of it, let it define me as someone who had failed as a father, or I could see it for what it actually was, a person who had never been made to face a hard thing, finally facing one, and not yet having the tools to do it with any dignity. That framing didn't make it hurt less, but it made it navigable. The thing about Troy showing up at that Tim Hortons, hands around a coffee that had gone cold, saying the words he said, That took something. Whatever he'd been before, that afternoon he chose honesty over self-protection. That's not nothing. That's actually the beginning of something real. I've watched him since, the way you watch a repair job on something structural, carefully, without assuming it'll hold until you've seen it hold and weather. So far it's held. And Callum, that kid, standing at Christie Lake with his line in the water, absolutely certain he was about to catch something, talking to himself about technique. He didn't inherit this mess. He inherited the possibility of something different. And I decided I wasn't going to let my anger at his parents become a wall between him and me. That was a choice I made consciously, the same way you make any decision that costs you something, deliberately, with your eyes open. I'm 63 years old, and I've learned, late but genuinely, that the willingness to sit with discomfort, rather than write a check to make it go away, is one of the most decent things you can do for someone you love. And that knowing when you've been wrong about your own role in a situation, not just about other people's behavior, and saying so without flinching, is a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with age or education. It's just honesty applied to yourself, which is harder than it sounds. I put my line back in the water beside Callum that afternoon, and I didn't need anything to be resolved. I just needed the lake and the cold and the kid and the possibility of a fish that was probably not going to come. That was enough. That was honesty more than enough.